do a lot of different things, so I also get a lot of different labels about what I do and who I am. And one of the things I do besides writing is I do music. And I had the privilege to study improvisational music a number of years ago, decades ago, I guess, with Paul Winter and David Darling, who are improvisational jazz musicians from the US. And one of the things I learned from them that was very important in my music, but also in my writing, and I think in a way is very important in all art, is that listening is very important. Listening and playing music is much more important than playing the notes. And particularly in improvisation, the need to pause and listen to others, and to listen to what else is going on, and to listen attentively. So I want to take this concept of listening and sort of move it into the idea of heightened awareness or heightened observation, like a painter might do, like a choreographer might do, paying attention to the music and how to make it dance, how to make it move. And I think that in the arts in general, this heightened observation is very important, and it's also a very important part of the aspect that we were talking about arts as a way of building bridges. So poets in particular listen often, literally, listen to their own words as they read them out loud, listen to other poems. But it's not only listening, it's also looking, it's also seeing, and it's this awareness and observation that I think is important. So I'll come back to arts and poetry more directly, but I want to talk about this heightened awareness also in the context of artists working together. As this is one of the places we need to listen to each other. This is one of the places I've worked at building bridges. One of the things I do is organizing events with other artists, with poets, and working on publications. So this is one of the things I think about doing as a place where we build bridges. And these bridges include collaborating in making the art, but also collaborating in events and publications. But mostly, it's about paying attention to what other people have to say, not just what you have to say. And I'm not so good at that, and I have had to learn that. So I'm experienced with these events, and I'm experienced with these collaborations. And I have two successful stories of listening I want to talk about, and I have one less successful or unsuccessful story. So I made Aliyah in 2007, about 10 years ago. And shortly after I made Aliyah, some friends of mine, people that I knew well and knew before I made Aliyah, introduced me to something called All Nations Cafe. And this is the first example of listening. All Nations Cafe used to meet above a checkpoint near Jerusalem. And at that time, the people who came were a mixture of different kinds of Jewishness. Some Arabs came. It was actually hosted at the land belonging to an Arab. I'm going to use a pseudonym for him. At the time, he was concerned about pressures that happened to him and things that happened to him, both from the Palestinian community and from the Israeli community, because he considered himself and acted as a peace activist, and he asked that we not do publicly his name. So I'm going to call him Abu. But he hosted, it's a common name, yes. He hosted this site, All Nations Cafe. People that came were international, as I said, Jewish people and Palestinians. Basically, the system that they had there, what we did there was tea. There were artists who were mainly musicians and writers. We didn't have a space for visual arts. So we would have tea, we would have someone read a poem, someone would sing some music, but then we would go around the circle of everyone who would come and just ask them to speak a little bit. Why did they come to All Nations Cafe? How did they see the situation? How did they see Israel? And the guidance was, we listened to the person speak, and we didn't comment. Later, after everyone had spoken, we would have a discussion about some of the things we had heard, some of the things we had learned, some of the things that these things had triggered within us, how we related to it. But first and foremost, we listened. And in that listening, and the first time I went there, I heard something from Abu. And this was one of my first times, honestly, where I had spoken to a Palestinian who identified as a peace activist who lived in the land of Israel. I had spoken to Palestinians before, but not in this way, and not in this kind of conversation where we were actually talking about the situation. And one of the things he said that I listened to, and I realized that he and I thought similarly, and many people do, I think, is that the hope was with the people. It was really with us, each other. If we wanted peace of some sort, that we had to make these bridges that we've talked about. We have to make some sort of connection with each other as people. And he didn't trust the leaders on the Palestinian side or on the Israeli side. He said that he felt that the leaders, this was cynical perhaps, but he felt they were interested in money, cars, and houses, were the phrases he used. They were interested in money, cars, and houses. And if they've solved the situation and made peace, they won't have those anymore. I mean, we may or may not disagree with that assessment, but I think that it was important for me to hear him say that. And what it did for me in a way was it triggered the memory I had. I had visited the year before my Aliyah, and I was here during the Second Lebanon War in 2006. And during that time, I had been living in Sfat, but when the evacuation happened, I came down to Jerusalem. And I went back to go get some stuff, and I stopped. I drove up the Bika, maybe foolishly. I drove up 90, and I stopped at a cafe that was an Arab staff person, and we actually started, I guess I said Abu was the first, I guess he was the second person I had this conversation with. We had a little bit of a conversation, not much about the war, just a little bit. And he had also said something to me that I thought was basically simple and human, which was education for children, for his children. That's what he cared about. He wanted to see his children get educated. And why did he want to see that? And he thought that was more important than all the other politics, because he didn't want them to work 2 jobs like he did. And one of the things I'm making with this story, that All Nations Cafe, and I've woven it into this waiter tale because the waiter was, I remembered it then, and it's something that I've thought about and come back to since then, is that basically many of us want, similarly, a better life for our children. And if we could somehow focus on that, and if in the arts, the listening part for me is that reflection now comes into my poetry. That I think more about writing about people as they are, as humans, not as Palestinians necessarily, or Jews necessarily, or Americans necessarily, or this or that, but trying to see the humanity in them. So the second example of this listening process is more recent. 2015, I went to Salerno, Italy as part of a world conference of 100,000 Poets for Change. This group helps organize or helps people to organize events around the world in the fall that are for people, poets, artists, musicians, actually it's expanded beyond poets, who are interested in positive change for the world. One of the things they've done is tried not to be ideological about this. There are sort of 3 things that in a way we reaffirmed at the conference, those of us who went as organizers, that are centered to it: peace, ecology, environment, and social justice. But how we interpret that, how we understand that, how we arrive at that, we don't have an ideology or a position on as an organization. And the organization doesn't expect the events to reflect any particular ideology. The emphasis of the organization is the organizers work locally, fit this theme into how artists and writers are working locally, and continue that way. Not to impose left, right, this, that view. The first time I did it in 2013, I organized an event in Jerusalem. I deliberately made sure I lean a little bit left. I deliberately made sure to have people who leaned a little bit right to work with me. I included left and right self-identified writers in the reading. I included an Arab poet. It's very difficult. It's very difficult because of coming into Jerusalem, depending on where people live. But we got one Arab poet who agreed to read the first year, another Arab poet who's agreed to read and read in other years. We've tried to have voices included in the collaboration. And part of all of this that I'm talking about, is that when I arrived at Salerno to do this conference, there were questions murmured about among some of the people from other parts of the world about Israelis being there. There were 3 of us who came. We had actually organized separate events in Israel, not the same events. And the feeling of Salerno's conference was that we were there to listen to each other, not to talk to each other in the sense of telling each other how things should go. And because the organizers of this group sort of said these are the rules, people listened to each other, and we made connections and contacts. So a poet that I'm still in contact from that is a Muslim from Kosovo who's Albanian national. But we made a connection by listening to each other and are good friends, actually. And there are others like that I made connection to, a Nigerian, a Hungarian, different religions, different groups, different politics than me. But we're able to make a connection. We're able to listen to each other and not try to impose what we thought was truth, and we heard more from the other side. And I think that I got heard there. I felt that all 3 of us from Israel got heard about what it's like to be in Israel, and got seen as being people who are human and genuinely interested in the humanity of others. And it was a very different experience than it could have been, especially given that it was peace organized. Now, very quickly, the less successful one was I tried a collaboration, and it was all Jewish people involved in the collaboration with another organization that was an environmental organization and a foundation that was a peace foundation. And we sat and we talked, and we were going to do a 100,000 Poets for Change kind of event, but we were going to do it together instead of just me organizing it. And I didn't listen well. I had my ideas that I wanted peace, I wanted environment, I wanted social justice, and I wasn't listening to what the foundation was saying. And I thought that they were saying one thing, and I kept trying to say, no, 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 we have to do this. And in fact, the collaboration didn't succeed because I wasn't listening, and I didn't listen to what the person from the foundation was saying. She didn't like the term social justice. I heard her saying she wanted us not to do anything about social justice. Later, what I sort of figured out and we worked out and talked about is she felt that the term social justice has a connotation to it that people would take as being a particular political slant, and she wanted to find a better term that would be more inclusive. That wasn't clear when we talked about it. It became a block. It wasn't clear in large part because I wasn't listening. So I want to return to art as listening very quickly, expressive of our observations. We express our observations. We listen with heightened intensity, and I try to include that in my poetry. I think it's important to build bridges, that we also need to develop a language of observation in art that is inclusive and that gives us spaces for listening, for exhibits, for readings, concerts, and performances that include people from all sorts of groups, that include people who might sit down across from each other on opposite sides of the political spectrum, but in their art or in their expression can share it together, can listen to each other, can see that, so that we can see each other's humanity, so we can feel the humanity, so that we can feel that sense that we all would like to have our children better educated so we don't have to work 2 jobs, and to live that way in a sort of all nations art cafe.